Welcome to Baden Hill. Well, in today's video, we're going to be talking about what some people considered to be a golden age, others considered a gilded age. So this video is called Gilded Age. When exactly are we talking about? We're talking about roughly the second half of the 1800s, particularly from the Civil War to the end of the century. This was a time of great economic and industrial development. The Industrial Revolution was steaming ahead, pun intended. And you need to know that as a result, some people were making an incredible amount of money. And with this money, they were able to live a lavish lifestyle. They were able to build massive mansions. At the same time, there were other people in extreme poverty. Often it was the very workers of the people who were making all that money. So we're going to start with Mark Twain's age. Mark Twain actually gets the credit for naming the Gilded Age. And you need to know that it's ironic, it's sarcastic. Mark Twain wrote a novel called The Gilded Age in 1873, and he was actually trying to expose this greed and corruption in government and in big business. And so, even though it sounds nice, because gilded means golden, you got to remember that when something's gilded, it's just the surface that's covered with gold. And underneath, it could be cardboard. So Mark Twain was writing his novel during a time of gold rushes. Now remember that the gold rush in San Francisco was 1849, and that was just one of several that changed the United States. There was also the silver rush and the Comstock lode near San Francisco across the border in Nevada. And you also had a gold rush in Colorado that totally changed the Rocky Mountains. I used to live near a place called Leadville. Leadville was actually a big mining town during one of those gold rushes, silver rushes. And, because you have gold rushes, you have mass migrations, people coming to those locations and developing businesses. You also have this incredible injection of money into the economy. Along with this, you have abuse. You have workers who are not given enough money because basically they depend on their bosses for jobs. And so when Mark Twain named the Gilded Age, he intended for people to see that in the middle of all this gold, there was rottenness. There was a problem at the heart of it. We also need to think of the development of transportation across the United States with the Transcontinental Railroad. And again, here in San Francisco, we have the history of the city is founded on the Big Four, meaning four people who were involved in the building of the railroad from the west, headed east. So there was the Central Pacific Railroad, which was in the west, and the Union Pacific Railroad, which was in the east. And they were trying to meet, and they raced each other because whoever built more railroad track could claim the land next to the railroad tracks. And so each company had very strong incentives, motivation to keep building. Well, in the West, the Central Pacific Railroad, a man named Crocker recruited Chinese immigrants to build the railroad. So it was known as Crocker's Army. Along with Crocker, the other three of the Big Four were Leland Stanford. So you had Stanford, Crocker, Hopkins, and Huntington. Those are the Big Four. And so as a result, the railroad was built, and where the railroad connected in Promontory, Utah, there was a golden spike that was nailed into the ground. So this is, just an example. Those big four became four robber barons. Robber barons were people who just had an enormous amount of wealth. The two most famous robber barons from this period, meaning that they were like barons from Europe, they were powerful. They were also robber barons in the sense that their money wasn't from inherited wealth or from being a good leader, that they actually made it from business and sometimes cheating people. So the two most famous robber barons in the U.S. were Rockefeller and Carnegie. And both of them have a positive legacy. That means they ended up doing good things with their money, but there was a lot of corruption at their time that kind of taints their reputation. In the middle of all this, Mark Twain was living through this. He was an author who was extremely popular, and he participated in this culture. He wanted to sell his image on everything from cigar boxes to self-adhesive scrapbooks and kind of weird products, but he sold his image and he made money doing that. But then he kept making bad investments. He invested in a machine that was supposed to create perpetual motion, and there was another that simply was supposed to be a printing press that revolutionized printing, but he kept investing money and kept losing money. So in his life, he saw triumph with making all this money, but there was also great tragedy. He lost the money, and he also experienced terrible loss within his family. His own daughter died when she was very young, and she was kind of the treasure of his heart. So that was Mark Twain's age. Another element of this Gilded Age was social Darwinism. Now, you know that Darwinism is basically the theory of evolution, and Darwinism made people start questioning their Christian faith, saying, maybe there isn't a God, maybe everything evolved over time, over millions and even billions of years. And so people were thinking about this scientific theory, and it started influencing everything that people did. They believed that, okay, if you have a world that's evolving, then we can make it evolve in a good way. And that includes anything that's negative, we're going to get rid of it. And so they looked around, they saw people in society who maybe they thought those people were weaker or less important, and they thought that they could actually get rid of those people. Sometimes it was people of another race. Sometimes it was people who had genetic challenges, mentally handicapped people. And as a result, you had some very evil things that were thought of, and some of them were actually carried out. So Darwinism is a part of social Darwinism. And as people, again, as they looked around, they saw this gap between rich people and poor people, and many people thought, oh, if you're rich, you must be the fittest. You must be the people who are the best. And Darwinism talked about the survival of the fittest. And so that means the weak people and the poor people, they're going to disappear. And they should disappear according to social Darwinism. So along with class-based prejudice, you also have race-based prejudice. So if people thought that a race was less civilized, they thought that they could actually get rid of it and extinguish it. Now, during this time, because the United States had such a great industrial development, there was a lot of immigration because some European nations weren't experiencing growth, and they were instead experiencing a lot of trouble, famines and difficulties. And so there was a huge influx of immigrants, and that led to people saying, wait a minute, the people who were here in America already, they said that we want America for ourselves. We want to keep immigrants out. Sound familiar? This idea that only the people born here deserve to be here, that's called nativism, and we'll talk about that later, but it led to something called xenophobia. Xenophobia is essentially a fear or a dislike of anybody who is foreign or has different customs, strangers. Finally, there was a practice that maybe was the most evil, and this was the idea that if somebody had a mental handicap, that the practice of eugenics was considered for those people so that they couldn't have children. They were basically sterilized. And eugenics is a horrible word because EU means joy, and gene, it means you have happy genes. But the only way for that to happen is to get rid of the bad genes. And back then it meant keeping people from having children and passing on their bad genes. So you can see that even though maybe people had the idea that they were making a better world, that there was great evil in what they were trying to do. We also need to talk about the literary movement that was happening at the end of the 1800s, and that was often called decadence. Now there's a play on words there because decadence includes the word decade. So it's basically the 1890s and it's a decade of decadence. What does decadence mean? Sometimes we talk about chocolate as representing decadence because you eat chocolate and you shouldn't, and that kind of thing is still used today. But decadence basically meant not caring whether something was right or wrong, just doing what feels good to any person and not caring about anything. The author that represents this idea most is from Ireland and England. His name was Oscar Wilde. Interestingly, Oscar Wilde wrote some very amazing, profoundly beautiful stories, but he's also known for just doing whatever he wanted to do. The 1890s economy was supposed to be so great. Interestingly, it wasn't great for everybody, and it wasn't as great as people tried to make it sound. So there were recessions during the 1890s. During this time is you have Mark Twain as one author, and he's trying to reveal the corruption and decadence of his world. You also have Jack London growing into the author that he would become. He actually died young at age 40. So we're talking about when he was in his 20s and 30s, and he was becoming famous and popular largely because of his stories that represented the Klondike Gold Rush. But that comes a little bit later, at the end of the 1890s, 1898, again, 1897, 98. So Mark Twain and Jack London, they both participated in this culture. Jack London was famous for trying to build a mansion and then it burned down. He also had this fancy boat called the Snark, and he kept pouring money into these things thinking that it would bring him happiness, and it didn't, and he ended up, again, he died young. So Mark Twain and Jack London, they're both interesting figures connected to San Francisco and the Bay Area. During the 1890s, you also have Gothic fiction. Again, you have books like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, little before the 1890s, but it fits into the same period. You had a book called Dracula. You had a book that was basically all about this industrial machine and what it could produce, and that was called The Beetle. And those books were all written in the 1890s. The Beetle is fascinating because one of the main characters is a chemical weapons scientist. He's making chemical weapons, which became a big part of World War I. So, along with this Gothic fiction that looked at the darker side of humanity and the double nature, like Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde idea, you also had science fiction. So you had Jules Verne and his ideas of exploring the moon or traveling to 20,000 leagues under the sea. You had H.G. Wells, who created the time machine at this time. People were thinking about the possibilities of technology, but in almost every book, you have both sides of it. You have the positive aspects of technology and also the negative aspect. One of the main things that happened during the Gilded Age is that not everybody was just going to go along with making money and you're supposed to be happy. There was a movement called Progressivism. Progressivism means that you're making progress. This goes along with the Darwinist ideas, the idea of evolution. We can keep progressing if we do certain things. And so progressivists believe that government could be used for good. And you still see this today, that people believe that you can use government to have regulations and you can have positive policies, even things like protecting the environment. The other side of progressivism is conservatism. Conservatism says, wait a minute, government should be really small and human nature is not going to change. We can't make utopia in this world, so let's stop pouring money into things like that and instead trust that people will follow their faith and they will do the right thing. And bottom line, the economy will take care of itself. Supply and demand is what will help people, and they'll get jobs because businesses grow. Well, progressivism wanted to do it a different way and use government for good. One of the main figures was Jane Addams, and she created what was known as Hull House, which was a place for immigrants who were coming to the U.S. to transition. And she saw that immigrants were the ones that were suffering. They were poor, they were in the big cities, they had bigger families very often, and a very difficult life. So Jane Addams was taking care of those immigrants. Another person, Jacob Riis, was responsible for shining a light on how difficult it was for the other half. So the rich people thought that their life was the way everybody was living, but the other half meant the other kind of life that people were living, the poor life. And so he did what we would call a photo essay, and he took pictures of people in poverty, and it made a big difference. People were awakened to what was going on. I should say, too, in England, Charles Dickens was someone who did a lot of writing about poverty, and like Oliver Twist, showed that life in this Gilded Age wasn't as great as everybody thought it might be. William Jennings Bryan, close to my heart because I was born in Bryan Memorial Hospital in Nebraska. He was from Nebraska, and he ran for president several times, and he lost every time. But he was a progressivist. He believed that big business should be held accountable, and one of his most famous speeches was called the Cross of Gold speech. And the Cross of Gold speech basically said that big business wanted to crucify people on their own cross of gold. And so he spoke up about the abuses of these big businesses and big monopolies. Now, the last thing that we need to talk about are, it's actually two things, unions and muckrakers. Well, because you have people suffering and working so hard, you have people coming together and saying, this has to change. Sometimes they were able to change the government, but other times they said, if we, the workers, get together and say, we're not going to work for this wage anymore, they call it a strike. If we go on strike, then the company will have no choice but to pay us more for what we're doing. And so one of the most famous organizers of unions was Samuel Gompers, and he organized what was called the American Federation of Labor, AFL. It later became the AFL-CIO. And so, Gompers was just one of many people who were trying to create unions so that workers had more rights. It should be noted that Gompers was not somebody who thought that, rich people should give all their money to the poor, okay? there was another group called socialists, and this is very similar to communism. The idea that there should be no rich people in society. Everybody should have the same amount of money, and basically the government should make sure that that happens, that nobody makes too much money, and socialism is something we still talk about today. So unions carried out strikes, but the companies also had a weapon, and it was basically to hire replacement workers, just anybody off the street who didn't have a job. And those were called scabs. Now, the people in the unions who were striking, they hated the scabs because it ruined their plan to try and get higher wages. So you should know what scabs are and how they affected strikes. And the idea of a strike is called collective bargaining, because you're collective if you're a group, and you can bargain with the company because you have power as a group. We also need to talk about the muck rakers. Muck is like mud and gunk, and rakers are people who stir it up. And there were journalists during this Gilded Age, during this time, who basically said, we are not going to just stand by and let bad things happen like this, so we're going to write about it. And two muck rakers are most famous. There are two Idas, Ida Tarbell and Ida B. Wells. Ida Tarbell wrote for McClure's magazine, and she basically exposed Standard Oil and Rockefeller and all the money that he had made, and how basically she showed him as being greedy. Ida B. Wells was African American, and she wrote about the lynching that was happening in the South. So she exposed that kind of corruption, a very different kind of corruption. And she, it's an amazing story, because she was probably in danger because of what she was writing. And so we have the Gilded Age. Unfortunately, underneath the gold layer, there's also a lot of muck, and it needs to be raked around and exposed. I hope this helps you understand this period. And once again, we're zooming through history.